Okay, well, good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Julie Chabdi, the Associate Director of Health and Wellbeing Program with the WorkWell Center, and your host for today. Welcome to Eat Well Bites, sponsored by the USC Healthy Campus Eat Well Subcommittee. Today's topic is on healthy planetary diets, eating to support your health and the health of the planet. Throughout today's session, you're welcome to use the chat or the Q&A to make comments and ask questions, and we encourage you to do so we can make this interactive. At the end, we'll have some announcements and share an evaluation link that we would like you to fill out, and then we'll have a raffle. Please make sure you're muted to minimize any background noise for today. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our Eat Well subcommittee co-leads, Professor Carrie Kritzer with the USC Leonard Davis School of Gerontology and Keck School of Medicine, and Lindsay Pine, dining dietitian with USC Hospitality. And on behalf of the USC Eat Well subcommittee, we're excited to continue Eat Well Bites this spring. These are monthly bite-sized 30 minutes, first Thursday of every month, sessions with the goal of providing you with tips, strategies, and resources to support you to improve your health and quality of life through nutrition and healthy eating. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll be sharing our expertise around this important topic of eating for your health and the health of the planet and engaging you in conversation. And also a big thank you to the Eat Well subcommittee members who have worked hard to create a health promoting eating environment here at USC. As always, I like to encourage you to stretch anytime during today's session, move, stand, whatever you like to do, whatever feels best for you. And with that, I am very honored to introduce our speaker for today, Kayla De La Haye, who is the director of the Institute for Food System Equity with the USC Dornsife Center for Economic and Social Research, and also a member of our Eat Well subcommittee. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kayla.
Thank you, Julie. Thanks for inviting me today, and welcome everybody. I am going to cover a few things in the 10 minutes that I'll be sharing some slides, and we'll open it up for a conversation after that. I want to talk briefly about how what we eat and our food systems impact the planet. I'll talk a little bit about the Planetary Health Diet, which is a set of dietary guidelines that are meant to optimize your health and the health of the planet. And then some everyday strategies that people can use if they want to shift towards more sustainable diets. So next slide. So I want to start off just thinking about all the many things we think about when we choose what to eat. And it can be a huge range of factors, things like convenience and what's easy to grab, the price of food, how food tastes and our preferences, our culture and religion, what my spouse or people around me are eating, and also things like health goals. And I wanted to ask folks in the audience, have your food choices ever been influenced by concerns about the environment or sustainability? And I'd like you to do a chat bomb, just putting in yes or no. And I might ask a few folks to share. So lots of folks saying yes. That's great. Okay. So wonderful. This is, I've asked this of my class that I teach on sustainable and healthy eating, and a lot of them say no. And so it's great to see there's a lot of folks thinking about this and a lot of folks who don't factor this in yet. For those of you that said yes, and there may be different reasons or different things that you think about, food packaging, different labels on something. I see someone mentioning seafood, different types of foods that you might choose or not choose because of environmental factors. So I want to talk in these next couple slides a little bit about why we might want to think about this and how we might build that into our everyday diets. So the first thing that we're learning a lot about is how much the foods we eat are interconnected with the health of the planet. So the foods that we now produce through a pretty successful and huge industrial food system, and the foods that we end up consuming through that food system, end up having really huge impacts on the environment. this industrial food system has been really successful at producing a massive amount of food for everybody on the planet and helping people literally have enough to eat. But the impacts of that have been bad for partly our health. Our diets in the US are actually the leading cause of death through their role in contributing to heart disease, some cancers, and diseases like diabetes. So this industrial food system has actually made us quite sick, and it's actually made the planet really sick. Some of the big factors that people are monitoring and are worried about is the amount of carbon emissions that come from the food system, the impacts on loss of land and loss of biodiversity of plants and animals, and also the impact that this industrial food system has on our water systems and polluting them, and declining soil quality. And the other thing that people are starting to pay a lot of attention to is how the impacts on the environment are going to start to change what foods we can actually produce and eat. And there's a lot of concern that climate change and the changes that are happening to the environment are actually going to cause a lot of problems in us being able to produce enough food and having food to feed our future generations. So things like concerns about monocultural crop failures, wiping out fish species or animal species are some of the things that people are worried about moving forward. The next slide. One of the big focuses for this research on looking at how the food system impacts the planet has focused on greenhouse gas emissions. And a lot of the data collection and modeling has shown that about a quarter of gas emissions and greenhouse gas emissions globally come from our food system. And you can see the bar on the right, what that's made up of. It is a little bit of the supply chain and transportation, but the bulk of it is coming from emissions due to livestock and fisheries, crop production for humans and for our animals to eat, and land use and things like loss of forests and things that impact emissions. Next slide. Some of this research has also started to look at, what are the types of foods that are the worst for the planet? And consistently, what this has shown is that animal-based foods cause the most emissions, and also sadly, chocolate and coffee. And so what this graph is showing you here is how much greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of food across a bunch of different types of foods. And you can see the ones that sort of are the worst offenders are beef and some red meats like lamb, and also other types of animal-based foods. And when you get to the bottom of the graph, you start to see more plant-based foods that have the least emissions. The next slide. So often with environmental stuff, I think it feels very overwhelming, but in the food space in particular, there's so much we can do as food consumers and as food citizens. And I love this quote from Michael Pollan, who's a writer and does a lot of writing in the food space. And he says, the wonderful thing about food is that you get 3 votes a day. Every one of them has the potential to change the world. And that might sound really rosy, but we have a lot of good examples in our history of our power as food consumers. A great example is trans fat. When people started to learn about the negative health consequences of trans fat, the government was pretty reluctant to ban them or make regulation, but consumers started asking for this and stopped buying foods that had trans fat on their labels. And that resulted in huge changes, and food businesses realizing consumers didn't want this and they got it out of their food, and eventually the government caught up and started regulating to ban it. But we do have a lot of power as food consumers and food citizens to ask for what we want to buy and what sort of foods we want on our plate. So next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about what recommendations have come out in terms of dietary recommendations to try to address this issue and make our food system and the foods we eat more sustainable. One of the most exciting advances in this has come from the Eat-Lancet Commission. And this was a group of international scientists and experts who work in nutrition, public health, sustainability, and planetary health. And they came together and put together the first set of diet and food system guidelines that think both about the health of people and the health of the planet. And they outline 3 action areas in their plans and reports that they put out. One was recommendations for food consumption, and they actually outline a planetary health diet that we'll look at next. They put out a lot of targets and recommendations for food production and what industry can do. And the third thing they focused on is food waste, and that's things that consumers and industry can do together. And they concluded in their report that food is really the single strongest lever to be able to optimize both human health and environmental sustainability. And they see a lot of promise in this. So the next slide outlines the planetary health diet that this commission put out a couple of years ago. And what they argue is that we actually have to transform, in the next couple of decades to different types of diets. We need substantial dietary shifts. And they're recommending that global consumption of fruits, vegetables, nuts, and legumes are going to need to double. And consumption of foods like red meat and sugar are going to need to be reduced by about half in order to really sustain our planet and sustain the capacity for our planet to produce food and to optimize the health of people living there. And so they say a diet rich in plant-based foods with fewer animal source foods is going to be good for human health and have environmental benefits. And on the next slide, you'll see a little bit more detail of what they recommend in this diet. I'll share the link to their dietary guidelines at the end. But overall, they take the plate approach. And so if you're thinking about what you eat in a meal, they're recommending half your plate is filled with vegetables and fruits, similar to the dietary guidelines for Americans. And the other half they recommend is mostly whole grains, some plant protein sources, some unsaturated plant oils, and they're recommending modest amounts of animal source protein. And if you click to the next slide, I'll give you like an illustration of what they really mean by this. So in any one meal, they're recommending actually pretty small amounts of animal-based proteins like red meat and chicken. And the upper range are actually the images you see on the left here. So like a pretty tiny amount of meat for any one meal. But overall, they're saying this should be your average meal. And so if we want to eat this planetary health diet, it might be that there are certain meals where you have no animal-based foods, like a meatless Monday type of thing, and other meals where you have sort of these smaller portion sizes of animal-based protein. So on the next slide, I also wanted to touch on, I think a lot of questions come up about this of like, is this good for people's health? And the goal of the Eat Lancet Commission and the Planetary Health Diet was to come up with a diet that was good both for people and the planet. And typically when we have dietary guidelines, we think mostly just about the health of people. They kept that in mind, but they wanted to think about planetary health as well. And actually, this reduction in portion sizes or the amount of animal-based products, particularly reducing red and processed meat, is likely to be really beneficial for the health of Americans. And that's because Americans consistently overconsume the recommended amounts of meat and eggs. And so reducing this is likely to lower our risk for diseases like heart disease, diabetes, and some cancers. And so kind of providing a little more evidence that these smaller or reduced intake of animal-based foods would likely be good for us as well as for the planet. So on the next slide, I want to share just a couple more practical ideas of how to choose foods that are more sustainable. I wanted to share this one example that UCLA has actually put out and might be something that we look to adopt on our campus too. And so their housing, UCLA Housing has put out this carbon footprint scorecard, and they actually start to label foods as red, yellow, or green, that traffic light label, not indicating just health features, but indicating the carbon footprint of foods, and that would help people to choose more of the green foods and a bit less of the red foods. On the next slide is a few more tips that you could use in your everyday meal planning or eating practices to choose foods that have lower carbon footprint. Things like reducing portion sizes of meat and animal-based foods. So some people like to reduce the amount of animal-based products they eat just by having a bit smaller portions of those in their typical meals. Or things like trying meatless meals a few times a week. And swapping those animal-based products out for more plant-based options, things like beans, vegetables, whole grains and nuts, or even animal-based meat substitutes. So on the next slide, the last thing I wanted to bring up before I open up for Q&A was the other kind of area of action that the Eat Lancet Commission really called out for people to do in their everyday lives. So in addition to, eating more sustainable foods, they are really making the case that both industry and consumers need to reduce their food waste. In the US, about 40% of our food supply ends up as food waste, meaning it's edible food that we throw out either at the retail or the consumer level. And that equates to about 130 billion meals a year that we throw out. This has major environmental impacts because it's wasted resources, wasted water. It literally contributes to greenhouse gas emissions when we throw this stuff in the trash. But the other part of this is as food citizens, and how we want our food to be efficiently and equitably distributed in our communities. And in LA County, 1 in 3 households currently are food insecure. And so this really doesn't sit well, both for the environmental impacts, but also the fact that a lot of folks need food in our community. So on the right are a few kind of easy steps for preventing food waste in your home. Things like planning ahead, not cooking too much food or having plans to use your leftovers and store them. And there's a lot happening in LA County right now about composting and on campus about redirecting food waste, if there is some, into compost instead of the trash. And at the LA County level, there's really exciting things happening where restaurants and retailers are actually not allowed to waste edible food anymore. And there's some really exciting companies popping up to recover edible food and get that redistributed out. And I'd be happy to share more information about that. So the last slide, I'll just point out, and I think these slides are going to go around to everybody, that there's some resources here for a lot of the things that I mentioned, the Eat Lancet Commission, a couple of great books about eating sustainably and eating less plant-based food or more plant-based foods. And then there's some great everyday tips for things like meatless meals and strategies to reduce meat intake that come from places like the Mayo Clinic and Harvard School of Public Health. And then some great resources for reducing food waste from the EPA and LA County that's doing a lot on this space as well. So I'll end there and open it up for questions.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Kayla. Such great information and well presented. There's some comments in the chat. Feel free if anyone has any questions to put it in the chat, and I can kick it off with a question for you. When you mentioned earlier about the high greenhouse gas emissions from chocolate and coffee, do you want to tell us why? Or what parts of the coffee and chocolate?
So there's a lot of the one thing I'll say is this science is somewhat new, and what we're realizing is it's really complicated. So some of the early conversations about eating sustainably really focused on eating locally, and that part of the issue with coffee and chocolate is it's produced all over the world and then flown in and leads to all these extra environmental impacts because of kind of the whole supply chain and system that's used for that. So that's part of it with those two products, but we're also sort of realizing the complexity of local is, something grown immediately within LA County isn't necessarily better for the planet than something that might be grown like a little bit further away, and that basically a lot of work needs to be done to really understand kind of the complexity of everything from transportation and soil impacts and water impacts and how we optimize all of these things. And so the Eat Lancet Commission actually goes into a lot of detail about the food industry and food supply chain and trying to optimize there. But that's a long way to say it's partly to do with those supply chains and the way that those industries are run. If they're both of those industries have issues with clearing land and how they're managed in foreign countries where a lot of the products are produced. So yeah, the slides share a little bit more detail about like the breakdown of where each of those sources of emissions come from, but it's a difficult challenge to really regulate some of these industries to optimize like planetary impacts.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that complicated question there. Question in the chat for you about meat substitutes. Are they nutritionally comparable to other sources like plant-based sources or other meats? So thoughts on that?
So yeah, maybe if you can pop back a couple slides to where the UCLA, like that red, green, and yellow, the one just before this.
Yep.
So I know this question is about, are they nutritionally comparable? So what I presented here, you can see actually Impossible plant-based meat is listed just below eggs there, the second green bar. And so when we look at, if we look at the impact of something like Impossible meat on the planet, it is definitely better for the planet than ground beef. But I want to probably open this up to the nutritionists on the call, because I think my take on the nutritional equivalence is that it's, you know, really no better for you than fried ground beef. But I think it's not that it's a healthy alternative. I think it's equivalent, but I'm curious if the nutritionists have other take on this.
Is your question, Kayla, about the Impossible Burger? Was that the
Yeah,
question?
so basically like plant-based substitutes, they're really not healthier for you
You know
than
what?
the original burger. They're
I
just...
personally stay away, and I'll tell you one of the key nutrition tips is look at how many ingredients are listed on your food label. And I appreciate that that company is trying to look for meat alternatives. I think that's a positive step. But for me personally, there's a lot that they put into that, a lot of processing that goes on. And I'm a pretty big fan of a whole food diet, of making my meals at home, doing food prep where I don't have all those additives and preservatives. So it's a slippery slope, double-edged sword, so to speak.
Yeah. And I saw a comment in the chat about like, what about something like tofu? I think that's a great, that's sort of what you're just discussing, Carrie, is like these really ultra processed alternatives. Probably the better option for you might be something like tofu, and it's a much less processed, and it's also good for the planet. So you tick both boxes.
Yeah.
Great point. What about grass-fed beef? Is that better for the environment than standard, like a In-N-Out patty type beef?
I do not know the answer to that question. I'm not going to say. I think whenever I look up questions like this in the literature, like, is one thing better than the other? Often I find the answer is complicated because there's so many factors that go into what makes something better. So, I think personally, I would opt for the less processed, less industrial option, but I don't know in terms of like specific emissions or planetary impacts.
What about in terms of like labels and icons or any wording on food packaging to help us make some decisions in grocery stores? Has there been any of that kind of movement?
So I'm glad someone asked this, because there's a lot of talk about this, and Some countries are doing this. Some local municipalities like UCLA is doing this and putting labels on things like this traffic light label. A lot of the conversation on this is like these labels can be really helpful for people to make quick decisions and have useful, simple information at the point of purchase. But also the concern is like we're sort of inundated with labels on foods with heart checks and the ethics of foods and whether or not people were paid, and then the nutritional aspects. And so some of the more interesting conversation I've seen is like, how would we kind of bring a lot of this information together in more simple ways to present it to people on labels? And traffic light systems seem to be quite effective at doing that. But the US government and the Dietary Guidelines for America has actually opted not to weigh into this yet. And at the federal level, like recommend certain foods based on emissions or label foods based on this. But Germany is a good example where they decided to put this into their dietary guidelines, and they're starting to label foods more at a national level so that consumers can make these choices. So my recommendation is always like start locally. Because the government's kind of reluctant to do stuff they think people won't like. And so if we start doing this at our institutions, in our communities, asking our local representatives that we want things like this, those can help grow things across the country and help demonstrate if it is helpful or works or not.
Great. Thank you so much, Kayla, for such an important and insightful presentation. And thank you everyone for all the questions. We don't have any more questions. So I'd like to introduce Lindsay Pine, co-lead of Eat Well, to share a few announcements with us and some exciting news for all of you. And thank you so much again, Kayla. Really great information.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kayla. That was great. So just wanted to pop in here real quick to mention a couple things. So first of all, these Eat Well meals. We're really excited to share that the Eat Well subcommittee in partnership with USC Hospitality has launched the Eat Well meals. It's been a couple months now, I think. The guidelines were really developed with nutrient-rich ingredients, flavor, and balance in mind, and they can be found at locations in the center of the UPC campus, over at the Ronald Tudor Campus Center, and then there's an offering over at the HSC campus as well. So you'll find the Eat Well icon on the campus dining mobile ordering app, also the ordering kiosks and signage as well. So we'd love for you to try a meal. And let us know what you think, and hoping to expand this program in the future. You'll see a few photos on the slide here of some Eat Well meals, and my favorite is probably the Buddha bowl that you see there on the bottom at Seeds Marketplace, which also happens to be more earth-friendly and is a plant-forward vegetarian dish. So definitely recommend that one for sure. And then you want to move on to the cookbook slide? Yeah. So we're also seeking recipes from USC faculty and staff to create an Eat Well cookbook, which is very exciting. We're looking for a variety of recipes from our faculty and staff to showcase our campus community's rich cultures. We'll also highlight skills, tools, resources for efficient, balanced meals, and partner with nutrition faculty, staff, student experts to identify optional ingredient swaps that can be shown alongside with the original recipe to help us all with making choices and to meet needs of our well-being. So I really hope that you will submit recipes today. Oh, and there is a link on that slide there where you can submit the recipe.
Great, thank you, Lindsay. And just a reminder for the rest of the series, we hope to see you at the rest of our sessions, and please tell other faculty and staff and students to join us. Our next one is Thursday, February 1st, where Lindsay and I will be presenting on how to navigate the diverse campus dining options here at USC and highlighting the most nutrient-rich selections, including the Eat Well meals and where they are and more about them. And we'll also provide tips on how to provide healthier options when you're coordinating meetings and events. And with that, we're at time. So we'd like to ask you to fill out the short evaluation survey that Suzanne will drop in the chat and also send out through email, along with a PDF of today's presentation. Thank you so much. Feel free to make suggestions for future topics. We hope to have this continue as long as you come. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen so we can do the raffle. We are raffling off a Trader Joe's gift card based on whoever joined the raffle. So Carla, give us a spin and we'll reach out to you, the lucky winner, which is Pat Gutierrez. Congratulations, Pat, lucky winner. Thank you everyone for your time, and we'll see you all next month. Eat well.